Welcome, everyone, to New Polity's podcast, Good Cities. So excited to have Nathan and Jacob on for Cars Part 2. Another day, but we're all wearing the same clothes. You figure it out. We have ended our previous session, which is very restrained. Nathan, you really kept yourself in check. Jacob, well done. I did my best. Sticking to the historical narrative of the takeover of the American city by the car, this hollowing out of the American city by the suburbs, which were enabled by the car, by the military product, which is the highway system, which has essentially disintegrated American life into compartments accessible by that all-encompassing compartment, the automobile. Having gone through that history in which automobile use is born out of war and industry, is confirmed in America's great experiment, kind of ends in the Cold War, and ultimately builds up a new police state, as Nathan mentioned, in which all are objects of surveillance and a constant police force seems necessary for the basic maintenance of the peace we now arrive at today. It's helpful, I think, to now look back on the car, not so much as a historical artifact, but simply as a reality that we deal with. What does it do? What is it like? And Ivan Illich, and I swear I've read other books, but Ivan Illich I find to be one of the most provocative thinkers on this topic and well worth considering, even though we might quibble on a few of his points.
You'd be in good company with a bunch of the new urbanists. They love Illich and his talk on cars.
Well, no one's invited me to their parties, so...
Oh.
Okay, oh gosh, coffee going everywhere here. All right. The reason Illich, I think, is very important is not only does he consider the car as such, but he really, early on, has an intuition that this thing is counterproductive. He begins with a provocative thesis in like 73 or something that cars make you slow, which was not evident in 1973. So all of this being said, I want to start with... Go ahead, Nathan.
I just had a thought. It's self-evident to anyone with children that cars make you slow. Like trying to fit multiple children into their car seats to go anywhere is just such an ordeal. Mm-hmm. It was just funny. Like,
yeah,
it might not be self-evident to the person who can just get in the car and drive away, but when you're struggling with a screaming 2-year-old, like, get in your car seat so we can go.
Totally.
It takes forever.
I had this.
That's all I was going to say.
I gave some friends a ride in a convertible of mine, and that makes it sound like I have more cars. I have one car.
Casual.
It's a
convertible drop.
This will come up more within the podcast. But like, I'm like, let's go. Want to take your kids in the ride? We had to take at least like 10 minutes beforehand of getting the car seats in the car.
Yeah.
And as someone who doesn't have kids right now, this is something I'm learning.
Yeah. So all that to say.
Okay, so we're going to start in...
Cars do make you slow, so enlighten us.
Ivan's got this great book, Energy and Equity, but I don't want to start there yet. I want to actually start with a work called Shadow Work, and to give a more economic discussion, not of the car, but of how luxuries or luxury items sort of become a feature in our own enslavement. And by enslavement, I simply mean like the obvious, which is that we are under much more necessity within our highly complex industrial societies than the societies that preceded them. We have to be more places and do more things according to our needs for money than previous communities would have to. Okay, so I don't mean to be like edgy with the use of the term. But this is going to be an odd place to start because he's really talking about women by a redefinition of women that happens in modernity. And it's very bleak, but I think it really sheds a lot of light on the car. Okay, so I'll read what he says. This is in the work Shadow Work. So he says that there is a world of subsistence in which things are basically worked for the sake of creating use values, which is a fancy term that means that basically you weren't that concerned with making money. Within this world, call it Christendom if you will, a new introduction of a new way of living, namely wage labor, which had previously been considered a sign of poverty. And Illich quotes a really great great story from medieval Florence where a gentleman dies, but he leaves all of his money to the poor. And so we have the records of what they did. They locked all of the poor into the churches and then let them out one by one in Florence and gave them their split of his pie. And what was really nice is this showed us, okay, who they thought the poor people were. And it had people you might expect, cripples, beggars. These were kind of formal categories within Christendom. And it also had heads of households who have to work for a wage. Can you imagine? This is a sign of poverty. So Illich's question here is, well, how did we get from point A to point B, where it's like the only conceivable way of life, head of household or not, is to work for a wage? Well, he says that one of the key mechanisms here was actually a kind of redefinition of women into a luxury piece of property owned by men. Now, that might not seem immediately obvious what's happening here, but I'll try to give my best description. Basically, the kind of movement of people out of the cities into factory work, the movement to a sort of the enclosure of the commons, the end of the game, or the making illegal things like hunting and fishing. These sort of experiments in Europe that were the creation of what we now call the proletariat. These were pretty much fought by people. Like, they didn't like it. There was a lot of rioting. I mean, this is something you talk about, like the movement of people from the country to the cities, as if it sort of just happened. But what actually happened is pretty much at every instance, people were very unruly and unwilling to submit to this regime, although obviously they had to in some ways. And one of the examples he uses that I think is phenomenal is the poor laws, which would basically criminalized vagrancy. So if you were not working for a wage, this wasn't simply what had previously been a sign of health and wealth. Now it was actually illegal if you didn't have some place to work. And so you would be moved to a poorhouse in England. Well, this was resisted. And often when people were arrested for essentially not working, they were rescued by mobs of people. And this is common. This is sort of the description of early, what we might call industrial capitalism, but it hadn't really clarified itself. But then you get this sudden break where everyone seems to be kind of submitting to this and moving on with history. It's no longer a fight. It's no longer a riot. What happens? This is Evan's question. And he looks at the way in which women no longer had the kind of prerequisites by which they had a domain of their own authority. So when you're working a wage, when you no longer have access to common land, the female existence no longer had a specific domain of authority and of labor in which you are taking part in basically agricultural work, raising crops or something like that. Now you had shifted to a society in which the man earns a wage and then the woman spends the money, And what Illich argues is that there was a sort of philosophical and cultural redefinition of woman as basically being a luxury item, something useless, something non-productive, something that the man had to go work for a wage in order to support. So all of a sudden, the man has a new need. He previously maybe needed a wage because of the force of enclosure and such. But now what's being insinuated is that what is natural to his life as a man is to make more money precisely to maintain someone who has suddenly become unproductive. You might call this the infantilization of women. Like suddenly they don't have work, and so suddenly the amount of need that a man has to earn a wage basically doubles. And precisely because it's linked to his own honor, right, like providing for your wife, it became a way to quell a resistance to this new form of living. Women were basically weaponized against men, as it were. This is Ivan's point. Okay, so are we a long way from cars? No, I don't think so, but wait till you see it. So he says that simultaneously, man, as head of a family increasingly dependent on his wages, was urged to perceive himself burdened with all society's legitimate work and under constant extortion from an unproductive woman. Wow. Man and woman, both effectively estranged from subsistence activities, became the motive for the other's exploitation, for the profit of the employer, and the investments of capital goods. Okay. Nathan, you mentioned at the end of the last podcast the price of the car, that it's expensive. And from the very beginning in its expansion into agriculture, you can see what's happening here. That when you get people to get into debt, to have a greater need than otherwise they had, you now essentially loosen them for more labor. Like they are now available for more labor. They are available to, and they have new needs that they now need to meet. And the way we choose to meet them is through labor. The car, I think, has this primary problem where it becomes the sort of unproductive piece of property that we must have and actually cements, both in terms of our geographical distance from places, but also in terms of our actual work. It cements us as needing to work in a certain way and to accrue a certain wage in order to be able to have access, as it were, to normal life. So in this way, I see a very similar thing happening where what happens is men are sort of saddled with a new need, but the new need becomes the very way that they access normal life. It's like, to get to work, you now need an automobile. And so in some ways you can see a continuity of a movement that began much longer, which is that, or previously, which is that what begins as sort of consumer goods, if we can convince people that they are needed, actually means that those people are more subservient and have to work harder or more or in different conditions, precisely in order to be able to afford a world that has become more costly. So it's the making of the world as a more costly commodity. And it seems like this is sort of the fundamental part in the what you might call like a war on subsistence that the car plays. Okay, that's my intro. I think it's very important because it's also the case that with the use of the car, you cement the idea that work and worship and commerce are all separate from life and family raising. And so you more effectively give credence to the idea of the woman and the family and the home as a sort of unproductive motivator of increased wage labor.
And we see this, I mean, all over. It's almost a crisis at this point of people who feel like they cannot get married because they cannot afford it. They can't afford the lifestyle of raising a family because there are so many accumulated and somewhat artificial needs that come with that. It used to be you start a family to help work the farm and create a good in and of itself, but now it's a luxury.
Yeah, absolutely, a luxury item, and we see this increasingly because marriages are increasingly only the wealthy get married. Yeah. Increasingly, it's a middle class sort of phenomenon.
Thankfully, as well, not only are people realizing how prohibitively expensive it is, but how increasingly undesirable it is. Not only do young people not want to get married because of how expensive, but the only affordable, or not even affordable, but available housing can be that single-family home on the outskirts of the city, totally divorcing yourself from some of the social ties you've built up, often within the heart
community,
within the community.
And I think if there's ever been, and I'm speaking anecdotally, like if there's ever been a cry of women, particularly, who feel trapped within domestic life, but without even the language to describe why it's a trap and why it's not fulfilling, I actually think it's worse now than it was in the sort of, kind of heyday of early feminism. Why? Well, because we've essentially completed a world in which the home, through the expansion of the automobile, has really been moved from any connection with both community on the one hand and work on the other. And those two things are not options. They are perfections of the powers of the human person, right? And so women, through the influence of the automobile, essentially are trying to normalize a deeply abnormal existence where largely it's still the case that men go to work and women raise children within these marriages, and those deeper needs for community and for labor go unmet, I find. Okay, that's a little anecdotal, but the point is that the car has not been without its effects on our spiritual life, on the relations of man and woman, and in its very expense, when access to the normal world comes at the cost of a high capital-intensive commodity that burns gasoline, then human life itself, normal life, faces a economic barrier, or you might even say a sort of test of how much money you have. And this is Illich's point in his book, Energy and Equity, where he sees this expansion of a technology beyond its sort of useful life as a way of concretizing a artificial, difficulty. Okay, now you got to pay to play. And what are you playing? Normal life, getting groceries and work and such.
Yeah.
So what does he say? Well, in Energy and Equity, he argues that the car is counterproductive. So it's counterproductive first because everything is moved further and further apart in accordance with the availability of cheap land on the one hand and of the ability of the car to reach it. So it's counterproductive in the sense that, if the car is there to move you from point A to point B faster, then counter to that, to its own sort of teleological end, is the spreading out of every place from every other. And we really are at a point where I think you can recognize this very obviously. Okay, so for instance, typically there are no bars in walking distance of American living housing developments. Okay, prior to that, you were tops 10 to 15 minutes away from an establishment where you could get a drink. Okay, so now it's the case that you drive, I would say, about 10 to 15 minutes to an establishment to get a drink. Okay, so beyond the question of drinking and driving, which will come up later, there's the obvious fact that we are spending the same amount of time simply in the commute that we would walking. So what's the difference? Well, is it just the same? No, because on the one hand, you are spending a lot of money to maintain your capacity to get to the bar. So I think everyone can recognize this. Like, it's counterproductive in this sense.
Well, I think you've brought this up before, but similar example with the grocery store.
Yeah.
If you walk 15, 20 minutes to a grocery store, yeah, you might be a little tired. Your feet might hurt. You drive now to a grocery store that has a giant parking lot. And just to put some numbers on it, I've done this calculation before. For a parking lot, to build a parking lot, it requires around 300 square feet of pavement for every parking space.
Whoa.
And so you...
Really?
Yeah.
Parking spaces are about 18 feet by often 9 feet.
Yeah.
Is a typical average.
So 9 by 18 plus the drive aisle
Right.
that's required. It's about 300 square feet
mackerel.
for each parking spot.
That
And of course, cars have gotten progressively bigger.
And the
so
parking spaces are getting bigger and bigger. Yeah.
Sure.
But by the time you find a parking spot, walk through the parking lot, get to the back of the store where the milk is, get back to the cash register and back to your car, if you measure it out, it's a pretty solid long trip.
I think we've mentioned this. I think
Yeah,
we
I did this,
mentioned this.
I had one of those. rollers. That
That's
clicks.
right. Yeah.
And I just went into Walmart with an available parking lot, and I walked more than the city block that it would have taken to walk from a parking lot downtown into like a theoretical downtown center where
a grocery store should be.
And speaking of the city block, you look in a lot of modern Walmarts, and you'll see right when you walk in by the carts, there's like this big map at the top that says your, Steubenville Walmart, and you see different colors, boxes of toys, groceries, clothing, and you start to realize, oh no, this looks like a mixed-use walkable downtown that's illegal to build in most American cities.
What Jacob is referring to blithely, I think you trust that people are going to be hip to your urbanist stuff.
Perhaps.
But,
Perhaps
we've
not.
found that the listeners of New Polity are largely dull and need a lot of like walking through the basics.
Anyway, keep going. We got off track.
Well, there's this. The car is a technology that enables centralization of power and capital. And one of the ways it does this is it allows you to take cheap land that otherwise wouldn't have a lot of value. Like, why would you build outside of your city? You wouldn't do it. But now, okay, everyone can drive anywhere. You can get cheaper land outside of the city. But this, almost inevitably, because it's from the ground up, is going to put that property in the hands of single, maybe 2-3 owners, as opposed to a sort of city that grows over time, which is going to end up distributing that power and property with hundreds of owners, even within a single maybe 1 or 2 blocks. And so what you have in a Walmart, even in a Kroger, any kind of big box store, a strip mall, is effectively something that looks like diverse ownership, because you have, as Jacob mentioned, an automotive section, a toy section, a grocery section, and you're able to go through these sections. And even in, sometimes I think a little more malevolent in recent grocery design, where they actually make sections look like they are owned by different companies. So corporate brands will make internal brands to items that they sell.
Yeah.
So like Kroger has a cheese shop, like Murray's Cheese or something. Well, there's no such thing. It's just Kroger.
Yeah.
But it feels convincing because you walk in and there's like a cheese man who's, he's not made of cheese himself. He's sort of in control of the cheese, and it has the kind of simulacrum of diverse ownership, which is a good that in its own right people enjoy. Like, what do we really want at the end of the day? To love each other in the kingdom. And so when you see something that appears to you as multiple people operating together, you're like, that looks like love. That looks like what we want out of life. And so I find it very distasteful. Well, the cheese is fine, but otherwise it's distasteful. But yeah, it is only made possible through the automobile that you could have this sort of faux diverse ownership. And to the same extent that we build these sorts of things for automobiles, we obviously lose our downtowns, our densely built multiple owners, distributed power, distributed ownership centers of civic life. These become scooped out.
It becomes ugly too. If you're building on cheap land, you're going to build a cheap building.
Yeah.
Now, the other way that Ivan Illich says that the car is counterproductive, it doesn't just spread out the world, which is obviously done, but it actually creates the illusion that you're gaining time because you are now responsible for the maintenance of a machine that largely you don't understand. And you don't necessarily factor into your total speed all the time you actually spend in the car. So this is very obvious. So my family, we walk to church, okay, because we have really what's a luxury at this point in human history of being next to our church. So we walk to church. Now, when we walk to church, when the transport part of our getting ready for church, so actually after I've beaten the children to submission and wrestled them into clothes they hate, well, that's not true. My daughter loves the dresses. Then we get out the door. Transport starts, and it takes us 10 minutes to walk to church. Now, the 10-minute drive is not quite the same, as you've mentioned, because you have to factor in the fact that your car was in the shop for a while, and the money you spent was produced through your labor, and it went into paying, not just for your oil change before that, but to the time that the car was in the shop and its use. So you have the time of your labor and the actual time of the car in the shop. And then when your car gets there, and I'm not factoring in stopping for gas or anything like that, you also have to get into the car. You have to buckle everyone into the car. You have to get out. You have to wait at lights and traffic. And then you have to find your parking spot. Mm-hmm. Okay, so all of this time, your commute might be 10 minutes, but your total time spent operating the car is probably half an hour by now. And Ivan Illich does some calculations on this. And I think it's important to say that I have no idea if this is correct. Because, number one, he was writing at a time using statistics that aren't probably relevant today or are not exact. But I want to point to the fact that it almost doesn't matter, because we all can assent to the basic truth that cars take so much time maintaining and getting into and out of and navigating that there's a loss even as there's a gain. I think we can all assent to that and then say, okay, well, so what he estimates is that we actually drive at about 25 miles per hour top speed.
Yeah, Chuck Marohn does this too in Strong Towns. He talks about the difference between driving through a city, what happens in cities today is that you have the core downtown, which is these days is very small, and that might have a speed limit of 25 miles an hour. But then you have this vast distributed network of stroads and strip malls and all of these shops and everything that is so distributed, but it's built along infrastructure that looks like it's supposed to be made to go fast.
Yeah.
And so you have a speed limit of 35, 40 miles an hour, and you have a lot of traffic lights along the way.
Yes.
And then maybe by the time you're 20 miles on the edge of town, maybe then you'll get to a real clear stretch of road that takes you from one town to the next. And that's where you can drive 60, 70 miles an hour and actually take advantage of that speed that the car provides. So he actually did the same calculation and said, if you're going to drive from the center of one downtown to the center of the next downtown through all of these various districts with all of these traffic lights and with all this 25, 35, whatever miles per hour, it'll take you longer than if you just had two dense downtowns. You drive 25 miles per hour through the downtown, and then 60 miles an hour to the next dense downtown.
Yes.
And it's a shorter amount of time that it takes.
Absolutely. And this goes back to our kind of historical analysis. There was a point, especially with the development of the American highway system, and Chuck mentions this, that things could have gone otherwise, and the highway system could have been utilized as a way of linking existing cities, so that on a larger scale, that experience would have been the same. Okay, you're going to go from...
It's almost like a train. I mean, you could have used a car in the same way that a train, you go from one train station to the next.
Exactly.
And you get off the train station, and once you're off the train station, you walk everywhere.
Yeah.
But instead, we...
went through the cities. We
broke apart the cities into their various components and said, you're going to drive from here to there, to there, to there, to there at 35 miles an hour with a lot of traffic lights.
Yes.
And you'll feel like you're going faster, and you'll be air conditioned, I suppose, but it doesn't really save you any time.
Right. So I would say that this leads to the first sort of spiritual effect of a automobile world, and that is eunuchry or impotence. Now, what I mean is very simple. The car, as a counterproductive mechanism, when you get into it, the results versus its capacity are so at odds that the experience is basically one of being demoralized every day. Now, there's many ways to experience this fundamental impotence of the driver. One way is to get next to someone at a red light who has a nice car and get a little bit envious and try to see if you can go a little bit faster than them, and then end up at the next red light having made a lot of noise waiting next to the same person. Only now you're a little awkward because in your need for speed, you both displayed the potential of the vehicle, which in terms of its actual capacities in the world is cut short.
I think it's very awkward when you realize you're both going to Walmart.
Oh, and then you get out? Yeah.
Yep.
And then you say, what should we do? Race
I should have beat you here.
Yep.
It's especially fun to do that on a bike, I have to say.
Well, the bike was the next one I was going to use.
If you're going through a downtown, and I'll be riding my bike through town, and I'll come up to a red light with somebody and just sit there, and I don't even know if they notice me, but the light turns green, and
I'm not a bike.
They go. I'm not a bike. I'm going to go faster than you, and I pedal along, just kind of at my normal speed.
You get to the next
and we
light.
show up at the next light at the same time, just like, hey man.
It's the tortoise and the hare is what it is.
What are you doing?
Yes. So there's that experience of impotence. The other one is the car has been sold, as understandably, as a extension of human power. Okay. So you know that we love to go fast. I mean, look at a child. A child does not need to run everywhere. They just do because they have it as a power, and they're innocent enough not to know that there's anything wrong with simply using a power to its extent. In fact, a lot of parenthood seems to be revolve around just saying like, hey, ease up a little bit. And so we know that we love to go fast, and it's a beautiful thing. And so cars are sold as an extension and a fulfillment of those desires. You want to be strong, this will make you strong. You want to go fast, it will make you fast. You want to be free, this will make you free. But what happens is we we actually, well, as we've said, you actually end up very slow. I mean, you think about those advertisements for cars where at the bottom it has the text that says professional
driver,
stunt driver, do not attempt. And it's a very fascinating form of false consciousness here, which is like the thing that we are showing you to get you to buy this car, you are not allowed to do. You would think, if this were a reasonable world, that one reading that text would say, well, then I'm not going to buy that car. But obviously it works because there's advertisements, right?
It gives you the potential to do it. I could.
Yeah, and in this way, it fits, I think, right with kind of deeper conceptions of power in America and in Western liberalism. So I won't go too briefly on this. If you really want to get into the weeds with it, read D.C. Schindler's The Politics of the Real from New Polity Press. But there's basically a reconception of power that happens in modernity where it's not conceived of as prior to act. Okay, let me simplify. So okay, I can't simplify. So prior to sort of at the deep roots of liberalism, which is the sort of philosophy that basically governs most of our inventions and technologies and ways of living today, there is a conception of God where God is not considered in his act, that is to say, who he has revealed himself to be, which we would say is the God of Jesus Christ, but for various reasons, which we shall not go into, is conceived of as a sort of infinite reserve of power that may reveal itself, that may act in such and such a way, in one way or another. Now, obviously, this makes a lot of room for diversity and pluralism within America. So the idea being like, well, maybe God properly revealed himself in the Presbyterian mode. Maybe he revealed himself, according to Judaism only, maybe Catholicism. The point is, who God really is this infinite reserve of power that could have done it any one way. And so this is sometimes what people refer to as nature's God. Okay. Now you can see how in the experience of divinity that you get behind the wheel, you actually have a sort of divinity that's very proper to our society, which is that you aren't judging your actual life. Like somehow this mist sets in when we love the drive, the car, and we're not judging how we're spending our time. We're not judging our posture, for instance. Like, are we moving fast? Sort of. On the other hand, we're sitting, and because we drive so much, we're obese. So part of the need for speed that isn't met is the need to actually be fast from within, as it were. But the predominant use of the car makes us very unhealthy. The experience of power there does not meet with our actual life. Like, do I have lots of time? No, I'm in traffic. Am I healthy and strong? No, I'm getting fat. Am I going fast? No, actually, I'm driving very slow through a downtown. I just get brief allowances to be fast. Am I free? No, I'm actually the most governed body in the history of the world when I'm on the road. Like the number of laws and surveillance, surveillances that I'm subjected to is immense. Okay, so all of the actual reality is impotent. But the reserve of power is present.
But I could.
But you could, damn it.
It's fascinating.
And I think that this is really, just to finish up this thought here, I think that this helps to explain the fittingness of the automobile for the society, right? Because no technology is without its society. These things operate kind of in tandem, right? Because you have to have production and consumption. You have to have the proposal, which is kind of already motivated by the fact that people will probably accept it in order to come into being. Okay, it's a complex social field. But if it's the case that at the very theological basis of modernity, there's a reconception of God, and it's also the case that like all of our major forms of life, I mean, we are the image of God. When we go about doing things, we do it like to show something about God. It also just makes a basic sense that the car would really only take off in a society where real power was conceived not in terms of act, but in terms of itself, power for its own sake. And this is what I think is so hilarious about the the impotence, right? Like the cars are now huge. They don't get smaller and smaller according to the reality, which is like, hey, we're using a lot of space here. We should probably shrink down a little. They get bigger and bigger according to the potentiality that never gets enacted. It's like now I have a huge car that has takes lots more gasoline. I am less and less able to maintain it and fix it. I am more and more a slave to it. It costs more and more. And in each instance, our actual power decreases for a potential power that we are banned by law from enacting. It's like you got to pick one. Either we go the Mad Max route. This seems like it would be just. Make the cars and use the cars and see what kind of society flows from that. Or we go the route of the church, I think, but which is let's get off the car thing. Okay. But instead, we're going to make the Mad Max machines and build up the police state so that you never, ever use them. The result, the American driver. Okay, there.
It sounds...
Go ahead.
Oh, I don't know. This is a far-fetched, but this sounds so much almost like nuclear weaponry. In terms of like we're going to make it as powerful as humanly possible, but because we all have these tools, we're never going to use them against one another. There's this great sort of myth within militaries where we're the safest we've been because we have these nuclear weapons, right? And we know how much they can hurt. And so they'll show these graphs of how, military deaths have decreased. But the problem with that is that they've decreased only until they don't.
And there's also a certain psychological damage that's done by that. Like, yes, the real number of deaths and real number of wars has maybe decreased, but we're all living under this constant anxiety of, well, I know there's that thing out there that could end the world in an instant. And we all just have to live with that.
Cars are safe only until they're not.
Right, you're walking around, you feel safe, and the reason they're getting bigger and bigger is because they feel safer and safer and safer. Yes. I need to be the biggest car on the road, so if I'm in an accident, I'm going to be safe, my family's going to be safe, but then you get out of the car, and now you're under that same threat of anxiety as you are under a nuclear regime of, well, at any moment I could get hit by one of these behemoths, and I will be a red splatter on the pavement.
And to that point, like the amount of anxiety that comes after the fact of getting hit by, getting in a car accident where like you now, if you total your car, that's at least $15,000 you need to have on reserve. Your insurance payments are going to go up if you're at fault. Not counting if you killed anybody or damaged anybody. And the moral guilt that has on somebody's conscience and everyone is at every possible moment potentially in the spot.
Yes. No, I think that's quite right. I mean, it also, sorry, the microphone. It also, for the first time in history, provides you with the phenomenon of necessary insurance. So,
yes.
So it's this weird thing where it's like you'd think insurance is basically optional because it's like,
it's insurance.
Right. I'm being insured against a risk. And so if I'm willing to take the risk, I don't have to get the insurance. No. If you want to drive.
The risk is so prevalent and so socialized that you really need insurance. Otherwise, you end up with, the tragedy of the commons, essentially. If no one has insurance and then we're all wrecking each other's cars, then who pays for that? I want to, you've talked really at length about the spiritual impotency that the cars bring, but there's also a physical
because as we know, there's no dividing the spirit and the flesh when it comes to
well, to your point of speed, in terms of like people recognizing that cars are meant for speed within the States, and this is pretty common now across most global transportation authorities. The way that you determine a road, we use the acronym LOS within the States, level of service. And this is a great point that Chuck Marohn, founder of Strong Towns, gets into in his second book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer. He did traffic engineering. Is that LOS, level of service for a road, is A, like in school, A+, good job. If you can go fast and there's no blockage, right?
If no one is using the road.
If no one's using it. And it's F if you're backed up. And what's interesting is that this is imposed upon the urban fabric without any sensitivity to context. And what I mean by that is a suburban arterial road is graded on the same scale that a dense historic downtown is. And so your dense downtown is often always going to be F because the roads are narrow and there's pedestrians everywhere that you're having to worry about, right? But it's, maybe B or A on that arterial because you're able
if you actually measure the number of people getting from place to place in that situation, it's going to be higher in the downtown, where the reason you're going slow is because the pedestrians are crisscrossing in front of you and actually getting where they need to go.
But then
you are sitting in traffic.
This measurement dictates policy decisions, right?
So
well, we need to be passing at A, right? So that we need to increase, even if you're the millions of dollars that can be spent to increase a road's width from like 10 feet to 12 feet. Oh my goodness. I mean, we're having that happen in Steubenville, you know? And to do what? Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the actual code tends towards the creation of
over-engineered
car-friendly, more car-friendly world at every instance. Like there's no context of like, hey, you are driving in a city. It's like there's one scale.
And that's starting to change. Fail. That's starting to change a little bit. There's definitely a growing movement, growing understanding.
There was a document that I think the federal DOT put out recently that made really at first in print made the distinction between a street and a road, which is I don't think we've actually properly described stroads yet on this podcast. I don't know if we want to do that
very quickly because I think it is useful. Just briefly, streets are for commerce and community.
Okay.
Roads are for getting you from point A to point B.
Gotcha.
So what would happen before the introduction of the cars, you'd have your street, your main street, and that's where everybody lives and works and does their thing. And then you'd have the road that takes you to the next town over.
I see.
What we have now are stroads, which are not very good at being streets because you're driving too fast to really take advantage of commerce or community. But they're not really roads either because they're too congested and there's too many places to stop to really be good at getting from point A to point B. And so we tried to put these two things together, but it ends up being really bad at both.
Right.
And that's kind of the standard. And so there is a growing recognition of all this, but we're fighting against 70 years of incredible investment in car-first infrastructure. And so it's not just a political problem that we have to fight today. It's a historical problem that we're fighting against the built environment itself and having to rework what has already been done, which is there's a lot of momentum that needs to get shifted back around. But I want to roll back a little bit. We've talked about the spiritual impotency.
Yes.
But there's also a physical impotency that comes with the vehicle. This is a study. It has not been peer-reviewed yet, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting paper by Jordan Nickerson at the University of Washington and David Solomon at Boston College called Car Seats as Contraception. And there is a real desire and a real need. Again, we've talked about, you're operating a multi-ton machine at high speeds, and if you get hit and you're not in it, your child is not in a car seat, they might die. Or at least get grievously injured. And so there's this real public need to keep our children safe. And so we require better and better safety requirements in our cars, airbags, crumple zones, things like that. But then also we require the purchase and installation of a car seat. I mean, they won't even let you leave the hospital with your baby unless you have a car seat.
They also have a time or a expiration date, right?
Yeah, you have to replace them every 4 or 5 years, I think. Yeah. So I'm just going to read the abstract here. I'm not going to quote the paper at length, but we show that laws mandating the use of child car safety seats significantly reduce birth rates, as many cars cannot fit 3 child seats in the back seat. Women with 2 children younger than their state's age mandate have a lower annual birth probability of 0.73 percentage points. This effect is limited to third childbirth. So there's a real cutoff. If you are in a sedan, you have room for the driver, the adult passenger, and 2 child's car seats in the back, and no more. It is very, very difficult to fit a third car seat in most cars. households with access to a car, and households with male present where both front seats are likely to be occupied. We estimate that these laws prevented 57 children's car crashes fatalities in 2017, which is great. 57 kids were saved because they were in their car seats. But they prevented 8,000 births that year and 145,000 births since 1980.
What's the scope of the study? Like in what geographic location? Is it just talking about the states?
I think the States.
Okay.
I think probably the United States.
Okay.
I haven't reviewed it in depth,
Sure,
but it's a compelling argument.
Yes, I get the
and
general.
something that I think is immediately self-evident to a lot of people. I mean, if you are driving a sedan, you're a young family, you just got married, you probably have the same sedan like you've been driving since you were in high school.
Yeah.
There's no need to buy a new car.
Right.
But then you start thinking, let's have a family. Let's have a kid. Let's have another kid. And then you stop for a second and you're like, wait a minute. If we have one more kid,
Yeah.
the entire physical structure of our life is dependent on us driving
Yes.
from point A to point B. And so if we want another child, we need a new car. And then you go and look how expensive a new car is. And your jaw drops and you're just like, can we afford this? Because babies are already expensive, hospital bills and all that kind of stuff. But to add on top of that, car payments that are approaching $1,000 a month if you want a new car, and still probably several $100s a month for a used car, plus the maintenance burden of that, it's astounding.
Amazing. This is obviously an anti-Catholic conspiracy.
And like you're pointing out, it's not the study focuses on car seats, but this can be extrapolated to just the car itself and its different sizes. I mean, we were talking, or before this, we're planning the podcast about you can go from a sedan to a minivan. There really isn't station wagons anymore, and then you have to go from a minivan to a CAV. A Catholic assault vehicle.
Yeah.
Those big 12-seaters, white vans. And just think about it. Maybe if there was a great acceptance of Paul VI's teaching on contraception by all Catholics in the States, and they just start having a lot more kids, and they all get these cars. Do church parking lots have enough space to be able to fit all of these? And now all the additional parking requirements that are going to be mandated to have CAVs. And I don't know if they're actually called, but...
You see immediately that the church's teaching concerning contraception is not just some moralistic, disruption of our sexual desire, but in fact always implies a world that the church views as just and proper. And right here, what's really just obvious about this thought is that the world that adherence to the church's teaching implies is not a world of the automobile. And I've said this in different podcasts. I'm not going to repeat it again, but it's been unfortunate that by framing contraception as primarily just a moral issue, a sort of do or do not, right or wrong issue, that its radical critique of a technocratic paradigm was left underdeveloped, let's say it like that, within the especially 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Because the obvious question is, if it is, or the obvious implication is that if it is proper to human flourishing, that the sexual act is open to life whenever it is performed, then what we have is a world, the structures of which make natural happiness seem unhappy, or at least unnaturally difficult to attain. And you see this within the recommendations that promoters of contraception give to countries that are slow on the uptake of contraception, so this most especially in Africa. I've discussed this before with Eric Brandy, and anyone can go ahead and look that podcast in detail, but the one of the things that's mentioned to help people use contraception when they're otherwise resistant to it is urbanization. And this comes with the use of the automobile. Like the kind of urbanization they need really is, there's no other form at this point. And so the expansion of these machines, it goes right back to what Ivan Illich sort of began this. It's you make normal life only accessible through higher amounts of capital.
Mm-hmm.
And what this does is it loosens people from their embedded local communities in which their work and their community belong within a walkable structure. You disembed them from that structure and you free them up to work in corporations. Now, I don't know who has the master plan here, and I'm not saying there's someone out there who intends all this outside of just the thing in front of them, the 10, what my dad used to call it, the 10-yard target as opposed to the 500-yard target. But the net effect is that we are busy creating a world in which the truth of the faith seems increasingly untenable for normal life.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think, is what is at stake. And this is why I just cannot stand the idea that Catholicism is anything less than a radical social revolution at this point. Because it never just suggests, hey, we've got a nifty list of moral behaviors you should adopt. It suggests at every point that these behaviors only make sense within a world in which power is distributed, in which property is distributed, in which communities are locally present to each other and embedded, in which power is for the weak. And if we do not have these structures in place, this life becomes a sort of riot against a exterior violence. Mm-hmm. And so all of which is to say, I mean, there's something quite anti-Catholic about cars. And if you'll indulge me, I want to talk about that a little bit.
Please go.
Yeah.
Unless there's anything else we want to mention with this marvelous
At this juncture,
point.
no. I think keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, so who are we? Where are we? We are citizens of nation states that have largely been established in the manner they've been established, in and through the philosophy of liberalism, which is a very unique philosophy in that it is a break with everything that preceded it. I don't mean that historically. Obviously, there's lots of breaks within history you can describe, but I mean it's self-consciously a redescription of everything that's past as being tyrannical and the beginning of new, modern, constituted states where life within them is considered as a sort of resistance of a dark, unenlightened past. And this philosophical description of man and of his world often goes unnoticed because it's just the air we breathe. Okay? It's like when you start to get outside of liberalism, you just start saying things that don't quite make sense to people because it's just normal life is basically been defined through the influence of philosophers and through the influence of theologians and through the influence of people who have accepted the basic tenets of liberalism, and then the way that this spills into culture. I guess we don't need to go into all that, but basically defines man as an individual. So at the very beginning, you are an individual, and anything social is a sort of extrinsic reality. Like you may enter into sociality as an individual, but you are not, as the hip people say, always already social. Rather, I am an individual. I have a certain separation from everything else. I have these certain rights granted to me. And if I desire it, if it's in my individual benefit, I make contracts. I make decisions to enter into social agreements, which can always be reduced to their individual parts, right? Now, does this seem bogus? I think so. I mean, look at a family. A child is hardly making a social contract, but liberalism especially thrives when it kind of ignores the familial life as an oddity of preparation and then treats adult life as reality, as opposed to looking at life as an integrated whole. It's like, no, nothing actually changes when you're 18. It's like, that was an arbitrary decision. Okay. So this description of man is very potent because when it was being developed, it allowed for a certain rejection of the Catholic Church, a rejection of a view of man as being fundamentally social, always bound up in each other. That language itself indicating that there's no such thing as an individual. Rather, what we have are families that we can then individualize people from. So individualization becomes a secondary thing. We can consider someone apart from his family, but not really, right? Like we all belong to each other, really. But it goes about enacting a world as if individualism is true. Now, I'm sure you guys have all heard the distinctions between Locke and Hobbes, but I kind of want to just get to what's common between Locke and Hobbes.
Yeah.
Well, I just mean, Hobbes is the, nature is red in tooth and claw, and Locke is the guy who's like, oh, reason can, just determine that we should all be quite nice to each other, etc. But I want to get to very briefly what's sort of common here. If we're all individuals and we're all pursuing our individual self-interest, and if this is a fundamental truth at the end of the day, then it leads to this difficulty, especially apparent in American life, where it doesn't seem to be true. So in the family, you really don't appear to be individuals who are at all competing for your individual self-interest. You appear to be part of a common life. And you appear to things like sharing, for instance, seem quite natural, right? You don't appear to really be an individual who has your own rights because you're born in obedience to your parents. So from the very beginning, the sort of philosophy, this description of man, isn't really met in reality. And this leads to a certain problem because we want the ideology of liberalism to map well onto the real. And one of the ways you can see this historically, I'm giving you this whole lesson, I'm sorry, is like what the liberals had to do is actually invent new origin stories for man. Mm-hmm. Because the biblical origin story it's completely social. Man is made male and female. The first thing we hear about is a marriage and a family that exists on earth. So they redescribe these origin stories, and probably the most influential one was Rousseau, who describes man as basically these individuals. They're roaming about in this primordial forest, and the family is this odd thing that happens very briefly for the sake of reproduction, but he describes the moment the child can stand, he walks away from his mother, and his mother they forget what each other looks like. So there's this brief concession to biological necessity. Like, I guess you have to nurse, but like for what, 2 years, and then you're good, right? And so then he establishes as a myth the idea that man really is individual, and then describes civilization as a sort of coming together of all of these discrete individual parts. Okay, the automobile. Now, I think one of the reasons that we can say all of these negative things about the car, but also despair generally that anything will really change, is because the car is not just a car. It is not just a mode of transport. It never was just a mode of transport. When it was sold, it was never just sold as a mode of transport.
It's freedom on wheels, baby.
It's freedom on wheels. And I would say most specifically, it is the realization for the first time of the liberal anthropology. Mm-hmm. It makes liberalism true. So long as you're in a car, the things said about man seem true. And so long as you're not in a car, they seem pretty false. And so it has this, because we all want to belong to our societies. No one wants to feel like their society is wrong about you. You want the thing to be true. You want to live in the truth. This is probably the most fundamental, basic desires for the world inside your head to have, to be validated by the thing itself, right? Okay. So what do I mean? Well, you can think about it very basically. Is it the case that we live in competition with each other? No, that's not how families operate. But get on the road, baby. And what you enter into...
just cut in front of me, and then he took my parking space.
Did he overtake me?
Yes. Right away, and everyone knows this, you have an experience of every other person within the car world as having their own interest, and those interests being inimical to yours. Not only inimical, but it's even a presumption of, I'm sure you guys went to driver's ed, that you are to take the stance of what's it called? Defensive driving.
It's the drive of all against all.
Yeah, the drive of all against all. That's great. Why? Well, because the presumption on the road is one of fear. It's not something I really mentioned in my big, long description of liberalism, but it obviously follows from the description of man as being an individual, self-interested individual, that there's a zero-sum game for resources, right? What Ivan Illich will later call the presumption of scarcity. So any person taking up a spot, is taking up a possible parking spot for me. And because of the car, because of its nature as a piece of private property that's big, it's not the case that you can quite share anything on the road, right? You cannot share a space the way that within the family, prior to getting into the car, you share common spaces, you give and you take. In the car, this is not the case. Now, there's things you can do to humanize the experience, obviously, but okay. It's also the case that it's deadly. The road is deadly. And this, I think, is another fulfillment, actually, of liberalism. It makes what liberalism describes mankind as. It makes it true, very briefly, while you're on the road. Ultimately, because that competition for resources is total, right? So man himself, his life is on the line with other men. And so you can see a sort of realization of the Hobbesian idea that in the beginning it's the war of all against all, and it really is war. The other big idea that happens with liberalism is that, well, if individuals are self-interested, and if society only comes out as a result of contracts that these individuals make, then order proceeds from above, as it were. Right? It's the thing that individuals submit to in order to get what they want. Mm-hmm. I won't go into this too much, but read anything Andrew Jones has written for New Polity, and it'll give you a good, thick description of this anthropology. For now, all I want to say is that in life prior to the car, law, order, it seems to come from below to a great extent through just figuring out what works. So, how do we talk to each other? Well, we talk to each other on the basis of seeing people's reactions and sort of changing what we're doing in accordance with them.
Yeah, the importance of sight is hard to overstate. Because when you are in a world without cars, it becomes immediately apparent that somebody walking down the sidewalk and shouting loudly at the person in front of them to get out of the way is immediately labeled as antisocial.
Yes, right.
This is bad behavior and you need to stop, and your parents should have raised you better.
Right.
But the moment you get into a car and you're sitting in traffic, everybody lays on the horn, and no one really thinks any worse of you as a person for doing it in most cases. I like to say that the moment you get behind the wheel of a car, any latent psychopathy in a person is immediately revealed. Mm-hmm. It's not that the car makes you worse. It reveals what is worst about you because you have cocooned yourself in a very real physical way from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And it's especially apparent when, if you've ever had an interaction with a car that has like heavily tinted windows and you can't even see the person driving. Mm-hmm. It's funny that, public safety departments love to tell pedestrians, make sure you make eye contact with the driver before crossing the street. Well, I can't make eye contact with the driver behind this gigantic truck that's 6 feet high and has a tinted windshield. But thank you for the advice, I guess.
Yeah.
So that anonymization
and
the privatization has a real impact on the way we interact with one another. Totally. That then opens the door for that liberal war of all against all.
Something that I think...
Absolutely.
Because we don't feel bad about it anymore.
Something I think you haven't mentioned, which might be a slight tangent, but in terms of what actually enables the sort of regime of the car that everyone can have it, is cheap oil. And what we've had to do and how we've had to restructure countries to provide that. This will come up later as we talk about the church and the land, or the city and the land. I just came from taking pilgrimage in Combermere, Canada, at Madonna House. I bring that up to say I had to pay Canadian gas prices, which is very expensive. It's more expensive in the UK, but comparing Canadian gas prices to American gas prices, we've subsidized and have made it a priority to get cheap oil so as to enable this life. Yeah. And the, frankly, military might of both business and really the military-industrial complex, which we've had so we could secure this oil, so that we could enable this. I think it validates liberalism as well.
Yeah, like it's in its global spread.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
And going back to the car as an idea of freedom, it gets sold, especially in more kind of conservative circles. The government is trying to take my car away. The government is trying to make me less free.
They're trying to put me in an EV.
Yeah,
That was a terrible accent.
this.
I'm sorry. It was offensive. I apologize.
The idea that somehow the car is actually giving you the freedom that it promises, while failing to consider that it is dependent on cheap oil that is provided by the very military state
trying to take it away.
that can also be turned against you.
Totally.
It's provided by cheap roads, which are provided by the very government bureaucracy that could also theoretically put you in a high-rise apartment,
Yeah.
is what they all seem to be scared of.
Yeah.
Failing to realize that the very infrastructure that the car so necessarily depends on is the same imperial infrastructure that could easily have been turned against us 10 years. Like, there's no reason the government would wait
Well, and this just
to have that take over for EVs. Like, why even go through that step when you could just turn off the oil and now everybody's stuck at home?
yes, and I think that this just goes to show the deep contradiction of libertarianism, right? You're speaking at it simply in a certain mode of its expression, like the maintenance of individuals with rights who operate not through common forms of peacekeeping, but through the assertion of those rights against other individuals necessitates, and in fact historically has necessitated, the largest state apparatuses in the history of the world: juridical, policing, everything. And the car is sort of like the juridical it amasses the juridical power unto itself, and the police power, as you mentioned. And I think that, so I'm just simply saying, like, I think this is always the contradiction, that, like, okay, I want to view myself just as an individual with rights that no one can take away from me. All right, who's going to, now someone's taking away my rights. Who do I go for? And it's like, well, you're going to need a cop. And it's like, okay. You know what I mean? So, like, the state and the libertarian ideology belong to each other. Yeah. Now, the other things that I think are worth noting is this idea that power descends from above becomes realized on the road. And I think this is one of the experiences. I have a friend who has schizophrenia, and he suffers a lot of just ambiguity in his life about his own existence. And he's always told me, though, he doesn't have a car, but I let him borrow it sometimes. He's always told me, I feel peaceful when driving. And I think this is so true. Like, I've never seen him so calm, like the voices stop. And I suggested to him, and he kind of agreed, that, well, the world's kind of simple when you're in a car, right? Like, there's instructions, there's signs. The signs mean what they say. Like, it's not ambiguous. And he was like, yeah. And I think that there's something to this for everyone, right? You don't have to be entirely schizophrenic to see this. We just have to share in the basic social schizophrenia of modernity. And when you're on the road, the world makes sense because order is enforced by the threat of fine and violence, really, which is administered by a state that we all in common agree with, and to which you are simply passive. So, like, you obey the law and you'll be fine. You disobey the law and you'll be in trouble. Everyone is under that same experience. Like, we're all under the same sovereign law, and no one is looking to you to be a lawmaker, right? No one is asking you to decide. No one is asking you to exercise your human reason.
You're not partaking or co-creating in any way. You're simply receiving.
Which is why
from the state.
Which is why there is a certain naturalness to the movement to self-driving vehicles, because, like the entire history of automation is always preceded by the automation of human activity, right? So it wasn't like we just invented some sweet automatic looms and we're like, sorry, weavers, you're out of here. It was rather that we first invented a factory system in which, the division of labor made everything kind of automatic.
You turned the person into a machine so that you could
then automate the machine.
Automate the machine.
Exactly.
And you're doing this. It's Uber.
Totally.
The drive from Uber to AI-driven cars is exactly the same.
But what I want to point out here is the way it actually has a satisfying effect because it realizes something we say about ourselves, which is that we are these individuals with rights and that things are ultimately decided by a central power that ultimately flows from the highest power, which is the state.
Yeah.
And that this is human life, right? It's not true off the road, right? Like off the road, I mean, granted, Andrew Jones describes liberalism as sort of always trying to make it more and more true by the structures it puts in place. But still, I think we can see that, generally speaking, you have to settle conflicts. Generally speaking, most crime prevention isn't actually through calling the cops. It's through preliminary neighborly decisions and discussions and ways of speaking and enforcing of shame and honor for different actions. It is man as a lawmaker within his sphere of authority acting as a lawmaker. That's what keeps the peace. And this is always at war with the philosophy of liberalism. And so it's not until we get to the road that the world described becomes the world lived. And this, I think, is this great peace, and especially for my friend here who's sort of because of his condition, he is in a world in which he's like the focus of sort of liberal care. And so he has, from therapy to the medical order, to the juridical order, like everything is sort of designed to give him a kind of navigatable life. But it doesn't really get realized, I think, until
I mean, it's very, this is such an overused cliche, but it's very 1984.
Sure.
The peace that comes with surrendering to the system.
Yes.
At the end of the book, he runs off and he's
I think
happy in a way because by surrendering to that system, you are now at peace with it.
within the car, you experience the goods of reality, of community in an individualistic way. And I think something that
it's all you get to mediate all of it.
That's how it's mediated. And I think something we haven't brought up yet, but that's important for Catholics, is that really in America, with the mass adoption of the car, with the building of the suburban parishes and Catholic communities, you then have a sort of abrogation of parish boundaries. You are no longer bound in a something that's
a shared community of faith
that you didn't
centered
choose.
on a specific location that other people might live in that you might not agree with.
Even your participation in the Christian life becomes an individual choice, because you now have the freedom to be able to get in the car, choose your parish. You can then immediately leave church as quickly as possible without having to ever want to
talk
interact,
to anybody.
interact with the greeter, right? It's just Jesus and you, You don't have to have the awkward, walk. And maybe somebody saying, "Hey, pal, you want to come in for donuts?" It's like you somehow you're faster than your car when it comes to you getting out of the church and getting into your car and going home, right?
Yeah.
Yes, American traditionalism, everyone. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and it's also with friendship. You drive, you're able to so cultivate and or not cultivate, but particularize your friendships, that you can just drive to the people you want. You're not really concerned about getting to know your particular neighbor, except maybe if you have a shared interest, or if you have dogs and you're going on vacation, you're like, "Hey man, would you mind just walking them while I'm gone for the weekend?" And that's the first time you've spoken to them in 2 years since you moved to the area.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a precursor to the smartphone and social media in
We're
a lot of ways.
We're going to save that one because I think there's no way I'm not going to talk about that a lot. So I think
how much more are we doing? We're doing part three.
Yeah, we just have to, guys. We're only so far through, but it'll be the shortest part.
Okay.
So let me just say this last thing to wrap up what has become quite organically and from the bottom up a discussion on the car as a certain realization of the anthropology of individualism and liberalism writ large. Private property. So one of the biggest claims, as it were, of the philosophy of liberalism is that everything is private property. If there's property, it's either state-owned, but private in the sense that only the state owns it, and then owned by individuals. So there's public and private. And I say property in the largest possible sense. So not just your house and the road, but also like the private sphere of life, which is, increasingly a sort of personal decisions, morality, religion, and entertainment all belong here. And then the public sphere of life, which is like law and order, things like that. Not the show. But in the car, again, can I just say, obviously not true. So we can sort of put up all these boundaries and say everything is private property, but our bodies themselves are not private at all. I mean, we are as affected by how people look at us and how they see us. There's no suing people for their expectations, right? Like they want us to behave a certain way, and we are such a creature that wants belonging. And so no matter how much we believe that we're just these private individuals that make our own choices, obviously we only make the choices and have the desires we do on the basis of the desire for honor and the fear of shame, the desire for love and the fear of hatred. We are social creatures from the beginning. This is why it all begins with pregnancy, like an inability to distinguish person from person. And this goes on into the kind of more quotidian description of private property, like who really owns the sidewalk? Well, it's the case within most city law that the business owns the sidewalk, but there's ownership and there's ownership, man. Like you police behavior on the sidewalk. You're affected by behavior on the sidewalk. No one runs into the business and says, "Sir, there's someone on your sidewalk that has, mistreated me." It's considered over and against what the law says as a common space shared by people who are mutually involved using their reason to govern it according to the peace. And this is true of the park. This is true of really everywhere. I mean, and in the family, you already have the denial that this is true, where you say, private property, who owns it? The dad owns it. Okay, so who gets to decide what goes on in here? The dad. Who decides what goes on here? The children. Right? like actual private property is not private unless you conceive of the family as somehow this absurd, like individual owner of house and yard. It's like, no, in actual fact, private property is the property of those who have the power to call upon its use. And let me tell you, buddy, those are your kids, not you. And if you've ever experienced the truly just debased version of someone who went through life really thinking that when he got that house and yard and car that it was his, and then has kids, you find the origin story of the man cave. So this... I'm sorry, we're a little far afield, but we're going to pull it back. This is
Plato's man cave.
Yeah, you got to get out of the man cave. So the man cave is the resentful reaction to liberalism not actually being true in the family. It's to say, oh my gosh, I was promised it all and got none of it. And so you invent for yourself a sort of chauvinistic interior space in which you get to realize what property was supposed to mean, that it's just this extension of your individual person, and everything was supposed to be contractual, and that means that 4-year-old has got to leave me alone. And by the way, I've decorated terribly. So you know what I'm saying? Like, so there's this like resentful attitude. This is the get off my lawn kid thing. This is the if you look at this house, I'll shoot you thing. I mean, this is a feature of American life where if it was true that we all lived in private property, we probably wouldn't need to remind everyone with big signs about how many guns we have, right? Like we would probably be able to say like, how naturally things are private.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to the car. Sorry, boys. The car gives you private property. Like you get a new body. And this body, as you've mentioned, doesn't give itself to a public gaze. It actually creates a individualized world in which the claims of private property seem true. You get to choose the temperature of your car. You get to choose what you listen to, what you hear, right? You get to choose within a kind of highly governed police state. You get to choose the direction you're going, and everyone else has to obey your rights, right? When you have the right of way, like the police will punish others for not giving you your rights, which doesn't actually happen normally. My rights are trampled on all the time. The right to free speech in my house, forget it. I don't have it. All right. So you see what I'm saying here? Like it makes the experience one of actually being the private property that otherwise you really aren't. And I think this explains a lot. Like it explains the road rage of essentially everyone's driving this insured extension of their bodies. it also explains, I think, bumper stickers in a large way. Like there is a need when you're in the car for it to express your person, because it's not just a car. It is the realization of the private body. And so you need to say, by the way, buddy, I vote Democrat or something.
Were you
right?
seeing, there was a few weeks ago, there was, well, you're not on Facebook, but various like police stations across the nation were sharing this like image of basically like every bumper sticker you could imagine on a car. Like it's basically showing for like personal security. You know, what are you letting people know about you?
Yeah.
And it's like if you have a military, Army, Air Force sticker, it has a little call out saying, my husband is away from the house frequently. Or if you have like an image of
The little
baby
the little
on
stick children.
Yeah.
They know, okay, you've got so many
you
children.
have this many children.
Oh, you've got a gun sticker
I see.
predominantly displayed. Well, guns are pretty valuable when you steal them, so they probably have some.
Or no, then it's like beach or like beach lover. You're frequently gone on summers,
Yeah.
and my house is easily raidable.
Well, I mean, this is
I
good.
think we should probably start wrapping this up.
Sure.
I don't want people to think that we're just complaining without any kind of solution. But though I will say, I mean, when it comes to the car in particular, it's so totalizing and so prevalent that it's an uphill battle.
Yeah,
Like
I think
this is, in a lot of ways, more difficult even than divesting from the stock market, I would think, for most people.
Totally, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you divest from the stock market, okay, you've taken your money out of a system that hates you. Fine. It takes a lot of courage to actually make that step. But in terms of your day-to-day life,
You can live.
you can still live.
Yeah.
Giving up your car is, for a lot of people, frankly, not even possible.
Yes.
The system is set up such that you will suffer real and immediate consequences. And so the way we go about changing this has to be a societal effort. There are individual actions we can all take. And I don't want to go into too much detail because we'll be doing another episode about how, like, what we actually do to make good cities.
Yes.
And that'll be a whole nother episode, and I'll talk about a lot of that then. But I encourage people to really start engaging with how they use their car. Really think about it critically and really think about some of the options available to reduce that dependency. And those options can be, maybe you get a smaller car. Maybe you have 3 cars and you only need 2, or maybe you have 2 cars and you only need 1. Maybe you can ride a bike. I know that it seems scary to people who have not done it before, and it can be scary depending on where you live, but consider it. E-bikes fit into this kind of weird halfway point where it's like a lot of the same goods of the car and a lot of the same drawbacks of the car, but on a reduced scale. So I don't think e-bikes are necessarily like a great long-term kind of thing. Like in the future, in the perfect post-liberal future, we'll all be riding e-bikes. I don't think that's the case. Yeah. But in the world we live in now, e-bikes are a great way to just one step back. Just even if you just use it to go to the park on the weekends instead of drive-in, that's one less time that you have to engage with this system. So it really comes down to slowly making smaller and smaller choices and structuring your life in such a way that you can remove those dependencies, but recognizing the fact that 2 things, the fact that this will require probably considerable personal investment to really take this to its logical conclusion, because the homes in areas where this kind of lifestyle is available are often quite expensive. The other thing you have to realize that by reducing our dependency on the car, we can't think that we're, by buying a used car, we're removing ourselves from the system of financialization that makes the new cars desirable and possible. The more we extract ourselves from the system of car ownership and car dependency, the more that system starts to break down, because it has been built in such a way that it requires self-perpetuation. Ford, GM, Tesla, they all need to keep making cars to keep making a profit. And so they're going to continue to try and sell us this promise of freedom. So even if our step is just as simple as buying a used car instead of a new car, we have to realize that the long-term consequence of that is going to be a lack of dependence on the car.
Well, right.
At the end of the day. We have to distance ourselves and
as you reminded me, if everyone buys a used car, the whole system is destroyed.
Eventually.
Yeah.
There will be a bit of a lag, but
Yeah.
it'll eventually collapse on itself. So we have to be, we can't be emotionally attached to the car.
Well, the gospel prepares for anything less.
Exactly.
I want to put my final word on this episode is just a reminder of why there seems to be a fundamental hostility to the Catholic life that occurs through the automobile, and why we would even oppose the automobile as a form of life, having already said that, of course, it's pretty sweet as a technology. And it's really not because of some kind of individual desire for purity. So you might notice, for instance, that we haven't spoken about pollution. Mm-hmm. We haven't really in a big way spoken even about energy use.
Yeah.
And we're not particularly jazzed by the idea that somehow clean cars are going to save us and there's going to be like electric vehicles that somehow are built without fossil fuel, whatever. Why? Well, it's not just because we're not like dumb libs, but it's also because we really do think that the good that's being pursued here is a kind of social order. Mm-hmm. The reason to oppose the car is not the car. The reason to oppose it is a kind of world that is inimical to human flourishing. Mm-hmm. And so when we advise, as you have, a sort of step back to whatever degree possible, you got to understand it's not to make your individual life better, though it might in this way or that way, but because it is the only way to destroy a grave obstacle to the living out of a truly happy life and ultimately a Catholic life. That's all.
Yeah, my closing words for this is when you were saying, in terms of private property, who owns the sidewalk, who has to take care of it, and the things that happen on it. I was immediately reminded of Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. Jane Jacobs was a early 20th century advocate for good urbanism, particularly opposing the destruction of New York that was brought about by some of the work of Robert Moses. Get into another time.
The power broker
himself.
Bro.
But she lived in Greenwich Village and would speak, wrote in the book Death and Life about the eyes on the street, as she put it, where when you have this integration of life that you see within a traditional urban development, often within America, we see the businesses on the bottom, right? Very much 4th Street. And you look around at your historic downtowns, you'll see that traditional urban fabric of businesses on the bottom and then apartments on the top. Oftentimes, this is where the owner of the business and their family would live. But, if you have a fight you see starting to break out on the street, or somebody suspiciously pursuing somebody else, you don't have to wait for the cops to show up to get that person, right? The moment you see that, you will also see other people. The butcher is already getting out of their store with a big meat cleaver, walking towards them, because there is a care for the community. Ultimately, we are communal, right? We are not the hyper individualistic people that liberalism tries to impose on our identity. And so the thing that I think should give us hope is that these, the disinvestment from the car is also something that is going to make us more ourselves. And you have to be able to consider that within your own personal condition, but also that what we're speaking of is not just individual Christians or people making that divestment, but groups of people, and suddenly seeing what new life emerges once you and your friends are making intentional efforts to walk to church together, bike to church together, and you see new dynamics of friendship and new dynamics of holiness that are natural just start to come out. And that's where exciting things happen.
Well, I'm really excited for the next podcast. I think we can probably go into more discussions about the kind of life that walkability implies and the kind of virtues that become accessible to us. And if you're listening to this while driving, listen, just be a good driver, be kind to people, open your windows and say hi.
Get a convertible.
Yeah, no. All right. Hey, everyone, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. As always, our best ideas are in the magazine, so please consider subscribing today and have a wonderful day.